In this lecture, we're going to talk about the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system consists of a series of vessels. They're somewhat similar to the blood vessels, but they are a completely separate system, and a lot of them actually run alongside the blood vessel. Instead of being full of blood, they're full of a different kind of fluid called lymph that is basically just fluid that's been collected from the body tissues. At various points along these vessels, there are lymph nodes, which are small organs surrounded by fibrous capsules. And we'll talk about these a little bit later, but their primary function is to filter and clean the lymph as it moves through the lymphatic vessels. There are also some other types of lymphatic tissues and organs that we'll be talking about later as well. And those serve a general immune function within the body. By collecting the tissue fluid and returning it to the bloodstream, it actually prevents edema or swelling within the body tissues. Lymphatic vessels also play an important role in absorbing fat from the intestine and then transporting that into the blood. And finally, the lymphatic system plays a major role in immunity or immunological defense and helps defend the body against disease-causing agents. And we refer to basically any disease-causing agent, it could be bacteria, viruses, what have you, as pathogens. Now, we mentioned when we talked about the circulatory system that the capillaries are those very, very small, fine blood vessels that run through the tissues, and that the capillaries are the site of exchange between the blood and the tissue fluids. So capillaries tend to be a little bit leaky. They're actually set up so that certain substances are able to pass across the capillary wall. And in part because of this, there's also a constant loss of fluid from the blood inside the capillaries out into the surrounding tissues. In fact, there's about 3 liters per day of fluid that's lost from the blood into the tissues through the capillary walls. And one of the major functions of the lymphatic system is to collect this fluid as it leaks out of the capillaries and then return it to the bloodstream. So in this schematic, you can see here's a diagram showing the closed cardiovascular system. So the blood leaves the heart through the arteries. It goes out into the body tissues. Remember, we have these capillaries where the exchange is occurring between the blood and the tissue fluids. And then the blood continues from the capillaries through the veins and then back to the heart. So this excess fluid that's constantly leaking out of the capillaries needs to be collected. So the very fine vessels shown here in green, the lymphatic capillaries, are picking up that excess fluid as it's leaking out and then returning it up through the body, and it puts it back into the circulatory system by merging with some of those larger veins before they go back into the heart. Notice that the lymphatic system is only going in one direction. So it's picking up the fluid down here and transporting it back up to the heart. Now, unlike the blood vessels that form a continuous loop, the lymphatic capillary have ends. So you can see these little blind endings that kind of weave through the blood capillaries and again are positioned to pick up that fluid that's leaking out of the capillary. Now, if we look at the structure of those blind end lymphatic capillary tubes, we'll see that they have these little things here referred to as mini valves. And you can think of it as a little flap. And these little mini valve flaps only open inward. So you can imagine here, if you were to push against it, and the area where this circle is, you would push open that little mini valve flap. Whereas if you pushed from the inside outward, it wouldn't open. It would just push it closed. So what this means is that when fluid pressure builds up in the tissues outside of these lymphatic capillaries, it pushes open that little flap, and the excess fluid therefore enters the lymphatic capillary. And that's the way that these little blind-ended capillaries are able to pick up that excess fluid. But the fluid doesn't flow back out because, again, those mini valve flaps only open in one direction. Also, unlike the circulatory system, there's no pump for the lymphatic system. There's no equivalent of the heart. So in order to transport that lymph from the tissues where that fluid was picked up back all the way up through the heart, we need to rely on, first of all, skeletal muscle activity, and then also pressure changes in the chest during breathing. So as you breathe in during inhalation, that will squeeze or put pressure on some of those major lymphatic vessels, and that will help to push the lymph back up towards the heart. And just like the veins that we talked about before, this requires one-way valve, so that when the lymphatic vessel is squeezed, it will push the lymph up, but only in one direction. The valves prevent backflow of the lymph back down into the tissues. Now at points all along these lymph vessels, we have hundreds and hundreds of lymph nodes. They're located all along the length of these vessels, but there are areas where they are particularly dense, and we have large clusters of them. And those are in particular regions of the body, including the inguinal region, which, as you guys remember, is around the groin, axillary, which means the armpit, and the cervical region, which is, of course, the neck. Now, those lymph nodes are helping to filter the fluid that was collected from the tissues before it's put back into the closed circulatory system. And I tend to think of this in terms of, for example, water that's been running through the gutters, through the streets, picking up dirt and debris, and then goes down into the storm drains. If we want to take that and put it back into our municipal water supply, we need to filter it first. There are a lot of microorganisms that can be in the tissue fluid, and we do not want to put that back into our bloodstream. So we need to make sure that the lymph is filtered before the lymphatic vessel merges with the veins and that fluid is put directly into our closed circulatory system. Now, because of this, it also means that these lymph nodes are very strategically placed to help monitor what type of possible pathogens are in our body tissues. So in a way, you can also think of these lymph nodes as little patrol outposts. As the lymph is filtered, any microorganisms, including pathogens, are going to get removed and are kind of stuck in those lymph nodes. So it makes sense that we would have lymphocytes, or those white blood cells that we talked about in the last unit, kind of hanging out in there and helping to monitor that. And when pathogen gets stuck or filtered out in those lymph nodes, that can cause small localized infections within the lymph nodes. And that is what causes what people usually refer to as swollen glands when they're getting sick or have some sort of an infection. They are not actually glands, but are in fact lymph nodes. We mentioned before that up to 3 liters of fluid is leaking out of those capillaries per day. So you can imagine if the lymphatic system is in some way disrupted or compromised, that a lot of fluid may start to accumulate in the tissues, and this can cause edema, which basically just means swelling of the tissues. So for example, elephantiasis is caused by a parasitic worm. They can basically take up residence in lymph nodes and clog up the lymphatic system at that point, which means that any of the tissues that normally are drained by lymphatic vessels running through there are no longer able to effectively remove that tissue fluid as it leaks out of the capillaries, and it will therefore build up in the tissues, and you can have very, very severe swelling or edema in some of those regions of the body. Over time, because of that increased pressure, that also causes tissue growth in that area. So if this is a problem that goes on for several years, you can have tissue growth and pretty excessive looking hypertrophy of those tissues. This is also a common problem with breast cancer. Breast cancer treatment frequently involves the removal of infected lymph nodes in that axillary area, and surgical removal of those frequently requires the wearing of compression arm sleeves to help prevent edema or swelling in that arm. Now, in addition to lymph nodes, there are other lymphoid organs that are found throughout the body. So tonsils are lymphoid organs that are found in the region of the throat. The thymus, which is an immune organ, we'll be talking about it a little bit more when we talk about the immune system, is found in the chest or thorax, generally on the anterior superior region just above the heart. The spleen, which curves around the left side of the stomach. Peyer's patches, which are small organs found within the walls of the intestines, and then also the appendix. These are organs that contain a large number of lymphocytes, and they play an important role in immunity and housing the lymphocytes that then go out through the blood and help protect the body against pathogens. Here's a histological section just showing the tonsils. And you can see these round regions in here known as the germinal centers, and this is where a lot of those lymphocytes are located within the tonsils. And the tonsils are strategically located in areas where they're going to be able to filter or remove pathogens that are coming into the throat along with inhaled air or food that is being eaten. So viruses or bacteria that are filtered out can sometimes cause small localized infections within the tonsils, and that causes swollen tonsils that can accompany certain types of infection. Now, the term MALT stands for mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. And these are basically just clusters of lymphocytes that are found in the connective tissue layer within mucous membranes. So the linings of a lot of body passages that open to the exterior. So here we see a tissue section that's been stained with H&E dye. So that's that standard pink and blue tissue dye that you guys have seen a number of different times. This is a section of the esophagus, or the tube that leads from the mouth down into the stomach. The O here is because this is the British spelling. We usually just start it with an E, but it's the same word. And you can see this darker patch down here. These are the lymphocytes. Lymphocytes tend to stain a very dark bluish purple with this particular type of dye. So this white part at the top is the lumen, or the hollow center of the esophagus. This first layer here is the epithelial lining, and then below that we have a layer of connective tissue. And I drew a line in there so you can see where the boundary is between that connective tissue layer and the beginning of the smooth muscle layer below it. And you can see this patch of lymphocytes, this MALT, running through that connective tissue, and you can see how it's kind of making that layer bulge out a little right in that region. Now, little clusters of lymphocytes like this are found not just in the esophagus, but in the mouth, the nose, the anus, the vagina, the urethra, basically any of those areas that are open to the outside or exterior of the body. And this helps, again, to prevent the entry of those pathogens. And then here's another similar picture. This shows the colon, or the large intestine, and here you can see a large dark patch. This would be the mold. In that layer of connective tissue.